speakers this morning. And so, again, thank you for being here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I have to tell you about the wonders of Google because I had hoped someone from the Rochester Diocese would speak on the Vatican II document, but that did not happen. So I Googled dignitaries and I found Dr. Hitchcock. So I called him. Actually, at first I emailed him, and he said, would you like me to speak for the whole week or just for the day? And I emailed him back, and I said, oh, just for the day. So he said yes immediately, so I was thrilled. And Dr. Hitchcock comes to us today from St. Louis University. He started his academic life there as an undergraduate. Then he went on to Princeton, got his master's and his doctorate, and now he's back at St. Louis and has been for over 40 years. He writes and lectures frequently on Catholic issues. He's the founding member of the board of the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars, and he's senior editor of the ecumenical magazine Touchstone. He also is associate editor of Human Life International. His books include Recovery of the Sacred, The Supreme Court, and Religion in American Life, which he's ironically speaking about today, and The History of the Catholic Church, which he's been working on for 3 years. He's on sabbatical right now, and it's coming out in the fall of 2012. He's married to Helen Hull Hitchcock. She is the editor of Adoramus Bulletin, which many might be familiar with, and president of Women for Faith and Family. So the Hitchcocks are very involved in our Catholic identity. So I am very happy to welcome Dr. Hitchcock.
Well, as I said, as you were warned, it could be that there's an emergency. If somebody starts waving their hands, I'll know that the Supreme Court is about to make its announcement, and we will stop temporarily. As some of you know, my trip up here was not completely smooth. We changing planes in Chicago, just as we were about ready to take off, they said, oh, there's a nail in our tire. I've never heard such a thing in an airplane before. And so they had to unload the whole plane and wait 2 hours before we could take off again. I understand that the theatrical troupe is, as you mentioned, driving back to St. Louis, but I must say, even with all the troubles with the airlines, I'm glad I'm not driving back to St. Louis. My subject this morning, very timely, of course, in view of the rumors that are coming out of Washington, is the Supreme Court. And, of course, specifically, the First Amendment and the beginning of the First Amendment, which has to do with religion. As you know, it begins, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Very short, and yet there's very few subjects in American history about which there hasn't been more controversy. And quite possibly because it is so short, because it's somewhat difficult to go back and find out what exactly did the Founding Fathers have in mind. And so there have been innumerable debates about that ever since the enactment of the Constitution. If I can put my watch in a place where I can see it. Let's take the second part first, which is in a way easier to understand. Prohibit the free exercise thereof. First of all, notice that it is Congress that shall not prohibit the free exercise thereof. There were a couple of cases in the early part of the 19th century where a state government infringed religious liberty, and when someone appealed to the Supreme Court said, Congress shall make no law. This does not apply to the states. Beginning, however, in the 1920s, it became customary to say that the 14th Amendment, which was one of the anti-slavery amendments, guaranteeing the rights of all citizens, obviously had to include the states. So since the 1920s, the Free Exercise Clause has been binding on the states, which was not previously. Is there complete religious freedom? No. Should there be? A more difficult question. Presumably, if there were a group of Neo-Aztecs, we would not tolerate human sacrifice. Okay. That's obviously a restriction. What about an issue that was settled a long time ago, but which I can guarantee you is soon going to become a hot issue again? Polygamy. The Mormon Church was forbidden to practice polygamy. The government threatened to put them out of existence. And they were browbeaten, you would have to say, into conformity. The Mormon Church has a rather convenient doctrine. We believe in what we call the deposit of faith. Revelation ended with the death of the last apostle. All of Revelation is contained, at least implicitly, in Scripture. It doesn't matter who may have had a vision of what somewhere along the line. That is not part of our deposit of faith. It is not part of the... But the Mormons are not like that. And so the president of the Mormon Church got a message back in the 1890s that God no longer wants you to practice polygamy. So they straightened it all out. They did the same thing with regard to race back in the 1960s. So in any case, that's an obvious limit to religious liberty. How do we feel about that? When that issue arises, those of us who consider ourselves pro-family, I think will be inclined to oppose this on the grounds that it is one more way of weakening the sacredness of the family. But there will be those, of course, who will say this is a matter of religious freedom because there are unrepentant Mormons who have never accepted the decision of their church. And then there are other people who practice polygamy maybe for non-religious reasons. In general, the status of religious freedom, therefore, was in some shaky ground for a while. The key case applying the 14th Amendment to the First Amendment, and of extreme importance to Catholics, was in 1925. It's called Pierce versus the Society of Sisters, and it was overturning an Oregon law requiring all children to attend public school. It's an attempt simply to prohibit Catholic schools. Earlier, the court might well have said, well, whatever Oregon does, it's no concern of ours. But in 1925, they ruled the law to be unconstitutional, and they laid down the very important principle: the child is not the creature of the state, and conceding then to the parents and to the church a prior. That's a very extremely important principle for us. Now, quite a revolution in the notion of religious liberty begins in the early 1940s with the Jehovah's Witnesses. And the Jehovah's Witnesses were controversial for several reasons. They were conscientious objectors who would not serve in the military. They were very aggressive proselytizers, going door to door, pounding on doors, ringing doorbells, and saying very nasty things about other people's religions, and sometimes getting arrested for disturbing the peace, sometimes getting into fistfights, whatever. But the principle that, or the issue that was most significant was that children of Jehovah's Witnesses were told by their parents, you do not salute the flag. When the students get up in the classroom and they say, I pledge allegiance to the flag, you don't do that because that's putting the flag or your nation ahead of God. So Jehovah's Witnesses were being prosecuted for a number of reasons. Kids were being expelled from school. And initially, the Supreme Court upheld these prosecutions, but suddenly the Supreme Court does a 180-degree turnaround, and it begins ruling in favor of the Jehovah's Witnesses. It is a matter of conscience. If you don't want to salute the flag, you don't have to. You can go around proselytizing, even if you make yourself obnoxious. You can't, use coercion or force, but you have a right to go around ringing doorbells and handing out literature. And more of the conscientious objectors cases were decided in favor of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Since then, from a certain point of view, that is since World War II, there has been a considerable expansion of religious freedom. Your employer must make some provision for your Sabbath beliefs. That is, if you say, I can't work on Saturday or I can't work on Sunday, your employer has to accommodate you in some fashion. There were a series of cases about that. There are some rather odd cases. You have a right, I mentioned human sacrifice before, which we would certainly not tolerate, but you do have a right to sacrifice chickens if your religious beliefs dictate that you do that. There was a specific case on that point, and it was decided in favor of this strange sect. But most of the expansion of religious freedom that has taken place since World War II has been, first of all, somewhat marginal. That is to say, it is people who are somewhat marginal on the edges of society, and tolerating them, expanding their freedom, doesn't produce any serious burdens or strains on society. And it's therefore possible to do this and to be very magnanimous and say, all right, you want to sacrifice chickens, you can sacrifice chickens, and nobody's hurt except the chicken. But there is no religious liberty that is meaningful if it's only for individuals. If churches themselves, if institutions themselves do not have liberty, then individuals don't have liberty either. And that's the major issue in the Obama health plan right now and certain other things. That brings us back then to the first part of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The problem is in the word respecting. What does it mean? It could have two possible meanings. Showing respect for, venerating, admiring, or simply dealing with. I'm writing you a letter respecting your overdue bill. It seems clear they didn't mean the second. They didn't mean that Congress could never, ever concern itself with religion. They probably meant the first, respecting an establishment of religion. What is an establishment of religion? Second big question. One thing is very clear. The Founding Fathers were against any kind of an established church. The congregational churches were established in some of the New England colonies. The Episcopal Church was established in some colonies. The issue arose most sharply in Virginia, where the, I should say, Anglican Church before the Revolution was officially established. There were a certain number of Presbyterians and Baptists who felt that they were being discriminated against, even persecuted in some cases. They rallied Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who were nominal members of the Anglican Church, supported them, got through the Virginia Declaration of Religious Freedom, even before the Revolution, guaranteeing this religious freedom. And it was applied to everyone. There were almost no Catholics there at the time, virtually no Jews. but it was made clear that it would apply to all religions. So there was to be no established church. Even then, it is Congress, so that some of the New England states officially still had an established church as late as the 1830s. Notice it does not say respecting religion. It says an establishment of religion. And as many of these quotes that are on the wall here indicate, the Founding Fathers were virtually unanimous in saying that we are a religious people and we must be a religious people. Why? Because that gives you the virtue that enables you to function politically. Remember, at this time when the United States is founded, it's a unique government, a republican government that has repudiated the authority of the king. That's a radical idea. To a lot of people, that sounds like anarchy. And the Founding Fathers worried about that. Benjamin Franklin, a famous remark where he said, we have a republic if we can keep it. And the answer to that was, you have to have a virtuous people. They have to be dedicated, they have to be, if necessary, self-sacrificing, they have to hold the good of society above their personal good, and they must have sound moral values, and these they receive from their religion. So there was a view that basically said, oh, all religions do that. You see, all religions inculcate virtue into their followers. Therefore, all religions should be not only tolerated, but encouraged and respected. So from the earliest times, we have prayers being said at public gatherings. We have George Washington begins the custom of prayer and a religious service, in fact, at his inauguration. We have In God We Trust on the coins. We have chaplains in the military. You go down and down and down, and in innumerable ways in which the government publicly and officially supports religion. The one place where it becomes a bit problematical is with the Indian schools, where the federal government has responsibility for the education of the Indians, and they say, well, that should be put in the hands of the churches because, again, the churches will inculcate virtue in this fashion. There were no Indian public schools, but then there's some debate between Catholics and Protestants about who gets how much money or who's responsible for which particular tribes and so forth, but it's a relatively minor issue. The Supreme Court during the whole 19th century never found a violation of the Establishment Clause. They never found such a case. Interesting, in view of the debates which went on later, can there be prayer in the public schools? Can religious schools receive public aid? In the 1840s, there was a case, can a school exclude the teaching of religion? It was a semi-public school. It was endowed by a millionaire in Philadelphia, but it was to be run by the city of Philadelphia. And he had said, I don't want religion to be taught in this school. And a suit was brought claiming that he was guilty of the crime of blasphemy, which was a crime. If you cursed God or otherwise spoke of God in some negative fashion, you could be prosecuted for blasphemy. The Supreme Court said, well, yes, okay, we'll allow this because he didn't intend anything by it. You see, he wasn't trying to be disrespectful, so he really wasn't guilty of blasphemy. But it's interesting, you had to prove your right to have a non-religious school, not your right to have a religious school, which in a way becomes the issue later on. In early 1890s, Congress passes a law prohibiting importing of foreign labor into the United States. You can understand why they did that. One might think that a Catholic church would bring suit and saying, our pastor is from Ireland, we brought him over, but no, of all people, it was the Episcopalians in New York City who had brought over an Englishman to be their rector, and they bring suit, and it goes before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, well, yeah, the law here is clear, but we know that's not what Congress intended, because we are a Christian nation. We are a Christian nation, says the Supreme Court. Now, that, of course, is problematical because what about Jews? Are you saying they don't belong here? That principle wasn't systematically developed, but it does show the mentality of the court at that time, and it didn't really arouse very much reaction. It wasn't as though people were up in arms and marching down the streets and denouncing the court. This seemed as though the court was just simply stating something fairly obvious. Beginning of the 20th century, there are a couple of cases of real note. One does involve the Indian schools again, where somebody questions whether public money can go to the Catholic Church to run schools for the Indians, and the court says, yes, you can. There's a Catholic hospital in Washington that's being subsidized by tax money. The court says, yes, that's okay. And another one that involved Georgetown University in Washington, and the court said, if an institution is performing a public service like education, then it is not an establishment of religion, and it can receive public support. And then in 1930, there is a case involving the state of Louisiana. The state of Louisiana is subsidizing textbooks in the parochial schools. And the suit is brought, and the Supreme Court almost in a way waves that away with back in their hand. Oh, this is not even a really issue. Of course it's okay to do that. That's not against the Constitution. Who would even think such a thing? 1930. 17 years passed. The Depression, the war, and for complicated political reasons, which we could go into perhaps, the nature of the court changes very substantially. Now, I mentioned the shift that takes place with regard to the Jehovah's Witnesses beginning in 1940. That's directly due to new appointees to the court. This is during the Franklin Roosevelt era of the New Deal. You remember that the Supreme Court had overturned some of the provisions of Roosevelt's New Deal. He had wanted to get around that, and he began appointing justices whom he knew would be sympathetic to what he was doing. And these men would be very liberal in other ways as well. Their liberalism showed itself on the one hand by expanding the rights of the Jehovah's Witnesses, but on the other hand, it began to show an increasingly rigid interpretation of the Establishment Clause. 1947, a case involving the subsidy of parochial school children going to school on buses in the state of New Jersey. People being compensated for that. Chief Justice Hugo Black hands down an opinion which proves that this is unconstitutional. And then he says, and so therefore we allow it. It's one of the most illogical decisions ever handed down. He said later, he thought the principle was important here, not whether the Catholics got the money, and so he was sugarcoating the pill, as he said. The next year, there's a case called McCollum from Illinois, which involves what's called release time. that during the school day in a public school at certain times, children go off into different classrooms according to their religion where they are instructed. So you're Catholic, you go here, you're Lutheran, you go there, etc. This suit is brought, this violates the Constitution, and the court says, yes, it does. So from that 47, 48, the whole modern idea of separation of church and state succeeds. When we are told, as we often are, the venerable American tradition of separation of church and state, you are usually being sold a bill of goods. You cannot find that prior to 1947. It is entirely a post-World War II phenomenon. I mentioned the case in 1930 about subsidizing parochial schools' books in Louisiana, and when one of the justices in 47 was asked, what about that case? He simply said, oh, has changed in the meantime. Didn't explain himself. That was the one case above all that would govern, should govern the decision in 1947. It wasn't mentioned. You probably know how the Supreme Court is very big on precedent, and they're always citing earlier cases. Well, you can twist these cases into pretzels and make them say almost anything you want. But they knew that the tradition was not on their side. Now, when, however, we have it over here somewhere, you see the name of Thomas Jefferson or James Madison, things get a little bit more complicated. Hugo Black in 47 and 48 proved this extreme separation of church and state by citing the writings of Madison and Jefferson. And he did, in fact, have a point. Jefferson was, in some ways, hostile to what we might call Orthodox Christianity. He was nominally an Anglican. The Anglican Church at that time was very weak, and he actually considered himself a Unitarian, which meant not only that he didn't believe in the Trinity, but he didn't believe in almost all the historic teachings of Christianity. He thought that was, the creed was just kind of a lot of humbug. And we know there's a God, we know God who presides over the universe, but we shouldn't go really much beyond that, what's sometimes called deism. And he had an animosity against Orthodox religion. He didn't say much about Catholicism, he didn't have much contact with Catholics, hated Calvinists, however, and paradoxically, he had helped to win religious freedom for the Calvinist Presbyterians and the Calvinist Baptists in Virginia, but he detested them. And after they had gained their freedom, he thought they were really a bad influence. He tried to exclude them from the University of Virginia and other things of that kind. Madison was far more moderate, but Madison also in his writings, private writings, talked about the danger that an aggressive religion might prove in the public sphere. Jefferson and Madison had both fought hard in Virginia for the principle that there should be no monetary subsidy of religious institutions. The Anglican Church had been getting all the money, and when it was proposed, well, they could continue to get money, but we'll give money to the other groups as well. Jefferson and Madison were very much against that, and they succeeded in winning their point. So you can cite, as Hugo Black does, Jefferson and Madison as on the side of strict separationism, but not even they go as far as the modern separationists go. They accepted the idea of prayer on public occasions. They accepted the idea of chaplains in the military. They agreed that You had to have a virtuous people, and they got their virtue from their religion. When the Jefferson and Madison were involved in revising the criminal code in the state of Virginia after the Revolution, does anybody have any idea what it might have said about homosexuality? It said anyone caught practicing homosexuality was to be hanged. And that was something that Jefferson and Madison went along with. They may not have liked it, but they went along with it. It was traditionally part of English law. It wasn't enforced. It hadn't been enforced for a long time, but it was part of the law. So even Jefferson and Madison didn't live up to the strict standards of a man like Justice Hugo Black. But more importantly, when we speak of the Founding Fathers, we should recognize that that's more than just Jefferson and Madison. George Washington, for example, did not have those same ideas. Patrick Henry certainly did not, who were both fellow Virginians, of course, with Jefferson and Madison. There were even people who thought Catholics should be excluded from this. I have to tell you that the principal spokesman for that was your fellow New Yorker, John Jay, who wanted to exclude Catholics from freedom of religion, but his position was very much a minority one. The point is that there was a range of opinions, and most did not agree with the strict position of Jefferson and Madison. Jefferson also thought that Orthodox religion is dying out. It's old-fashioned, the new scientific age, nobody can take that seriously anymore. So Unitarian, by the time I die, he says, most Americans will be Unitarians. He died in 1825, 26. Unfortunately for him, it was while he was president in the early 19th century that there occurred what came to be called the Second Great Awakening, a tremendous resurgence of evangelical religion, primarily out on the frontier in Kentucky, Western Virginia, and so forth. And I say that in American culture, I always say that evangelical religion is like petroleum. It's everywhere under the ground, and you never know when it's going to come spurting out again. And there's been a tremendous evangelical, or if you want, fundamentalist revival, say in the last 30 years or so, after many people thought that it was dying on the vine. They are the fastest growing churches, the most vigorous Protestant churches. They have eclipsed the so-called mainline churches, which are all in decline. And the roots of that to be found in the Second Great Awakening. Puritanism was losing some of its power in New England, but as it was losing its power in New England, it kind of reconstituted itself on the frontier, and from there it spread to the rest of the country. So by the time Jefferson does die, it's a rather different country from the one that he was familiar with. And from that point on, the old, very strict Jeffersonian position on church and state was not part of the mainstream. It was not what the Supreme Court thought. It was not what most politicians thought. It was revived. It was dug up out of old books by Hugo Black in 1947 and sold then as the real meaning of the Constitution. Now, there were constitutional scholars who were not necessarily religious believers who pointed out in 1947 and 8 how unhistorical this was. This is a misreading of history. But it went through. It gained the general support of the media. So there's a kind of an editorial page, constitutional philosophy, which should be told over and over and over again about our great tradition of separation of church and state. And of course, they went on from then to expand it. It became an issue primarily in two areas. One was no religious practices of any kind in public schools, no Bible reading, no prayers, questionable whether religious groups can be allowed to meet on public school property, etc. And on the other hand, aid to private religious schools, very, very restricted, in most cases denied. And if you look at the philosophical background of the leading figures in this, again, Hugo Black is an excellent example, but he's not the only one. He had been raised a Southern Baptist, but he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and he was a racist. And but he underwent a kind of a conversion. He becomes very liberal, Hugo Black, probably reacting against his own background, I would guess, becomes hostile, really, to Orthodox religion. He grew up, he was an anti-Catholic. That was one part of it. He didn't repent. He went on being anti-Catholic. He is, I say, one example. A new book just out about an incident that has been well known, that in 1920-something or other, a Methodist minister in Birmingham, Alabama, went up and shot a Catholic priest to death while the priest was sitting on his front porch. Reasons why he did it are somewhat complicated. The Methodist minister got off. His lawyer was Hugo Black, who pushed all the buttons on anti-Catholicism and also racism, which figured into it in a somewhat oblique way. But as I say, Black's one example. We could cite several more on the court who have those kinds of prejudices, and it's also, in a way, kind of philosophical, because probably the most influential American philosopher was John Dewey, who lived, I guess, into the 1950s. And Dewey was very much anti-religious in the traditional sense. He thought that religion, being based on a concept of divine authority, was undemocratic, didn't fit with a democratic society. And he thought that public schools really should try to eliminate religious influence, and the kids will come to school maybe having been made Christians by their parents, but these public schools can undo a lot of that, and he thought they should. And I believe that was in the background of what the Supreme Court began to do in 1947. Now, another aspect of this, which is the one we're confronting right now, as we await word from Washington on the Supreme Court decision, is the welfare state. Now, the concept of the welfare state goes back into the 19th century, was enacted first in certain European countries, and it had been pretty much not an element in American life until Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. And the essence of the New Deal, in many ways, is the establishment of the welfare state. What is the welfare state? Well, it's a fairly simple idea, and that is when people are in suffering or need and they can't take care of themselves, or there doesn't seem to be anybody else to take care of it, the government should step in. It's often called the safety net theory. So it involves unemployment compensation, it involves workman's compensation for injury, it involves Social Security, although of course Social Security was supposed to be financed by the participants themselves, not by the government, and a few other things of that kind. By and large, Catholic social thought, bishops and others, supported the welfare state. They thought it was a legitimate expression of Christian charity, and as a matter of fact still do. For all the objections that have been raised to the Obama health program, by and large the bishops still tilt towards the idea of the government should step in and help the needy. The problem is that the definition of need keeps expanding. the government then begins, first of all, to take responsibility for areas of life that previously were not its responsibility. There was a time when you should take care of your own elderly parents, or if there's a needy person in the parish should, the church should take care of that. In the modern liberal idea of the welfare state, all of that is kind of, at best, inadequate or kind of messy. We ought to have government programs that are organized to go in there and do it. There's almost like no room for private charity here in the face of this large government. Also, what is welfare? And here what we see, of course, in the great controversy over the Obama insurance plan and the mandating of contraceptive coverage, and I think realistically would have to say in the future abortion coverage, because sexual activity is in a way part of welfare. First of all, in a medical sense, woman doesn't want to get pregnant or she's already pregnant, got to do something about it. But more than that, there's no room for any idea here of chastity. That's kind of an outmoded dogma. Of course we expect healthy modern people to be sexually active, and therefore provision of contraceptives should be part of any comprehensive welfare program. Who would deny that? And so while the bishops and others have tried to keep the public's eye on the religious freedom issue, namely, you're trying to tell the Catholic Church what to do, you're not respecting its freedom, the supporters of the health plan try to keep people's eye on birth control. You see, they're just anti-birth control. They don't think you should be allowed to have birth control. You want birth control, don't you? And you should have it. There was a student from Georgetown University testified before Congress, you may remember, a couple months ago, complaining about she and her fellow students couldn't afford contraceptives, and that this needed to be part of any government plan. Well, some people did the math and came up with a ridiculously small amount of money that she would have needed to buy her contraceptives, and pointed out, contrasting that with what she was paying for tuition and what she was probably paying for going to the bar every Friday night with her boyfriends, and it was just simply a kind of a propaganda matter. Now, this brings me back to one of my original points with regard to religious freedom, and that is, there is no religious freedom if it's only freedom for individuals. If there's no freedom for churches, then there is no freedom, because the individual is really hopeless against the vastness of the government or the vastness of society. If I were somebody who was engaged in sacrificing chickens, I would be happy that the Supreme Court had issued that decision, but I wouldn't feel terribly secure because I'm surprised the animal rights people haven't been able to overturn that. So it would leave you really quite vulnerable. But if churches are healthy, if churches are vigorous, if churches can stand up to the government, then there is true religious freedom. And that is certainly, again, one of the issues that's involved in the Obama health plan. One of the most important principles that the Supreme Court ever laid down, and it's not even really sort of taken for granted, beginning in the 1870s, that when there is an internal church dispute, it will be decided, and somebody goes to court with it, it will be decided on the basis of the governing rules of the church itself, not on the basis of civil law. So, for example, if a group in a Catholic parish were to vote to get rid of their pastor, and they locked him out of the rectory, and the case went to court, the court would say, what does the Catholic Church say about that? Well, it says pastors are appointed by the bishop. Okay, who's the bishop? Okay, did he appoint Father so-and-so? Yes, he did. Has he rescinded the appointment? No, he hasn't. Okay, Father so-and-so is the legitimate pastor of this parish. This is an extremely important principle in upholding, again, the freedom of churches as opposed to the freedom of individuals. You can, if you think your pastor's a heretic and he shouldn't be in office because he doesn't teach Catholic doctrine, that won't wash in court because the court said a long time ago the law knows no heresy. The only issue would be how did he get there? Did he get there through the normal processes? And this is a very, very important principle. And it's the one again, which is under threat from the Obama healthcare rules, in which no matter, you'll see a lot of letters in the press from people saying, well, I'm a Catholic, I don't believe in birth control. The Catholic Church has got to overcome that old-fashioned idea of it, that it has. Well, okay, we can debate birth control within the confines of the Catholic Church, but it is the decision of the Church itself what it will teach on that question. And it is not the business of the government or anybody else outside to attempt to change that. And in a somewhat, I don't think that issue has been emphasized enough here, that the Obama health plan constitutes a threat to the autonomy of the churches, to religious freedom, not just for individuals, but for churches. Well, there are many, many other things which we could say here, but I guess I'll stop at this point. I'll be glad to entertain questions or comments. I forgot and left my hearing aid behind in St. Louis, so if you wanted to speak, you'd probably make an attempt to be fairly loud. Or if I don't get it, maybe somebody else can repeat it. Maybe I'll assign you as sitting in the front row to hear what people say and relay the question to me.
Dr. Hitchcock, it seems as if the statement about the internal laws of the church might be is stressed for some churches, some church groups like, say the Amish, their dispensations, correct? But the Catholic Church's rights are not to be expressed either by us or by the government. So the government is allowing some people to get by and not follow the government, but not others. Is that correct?
Can you repeat
He's
that?
saying that the Amish church has some dispensations,
The Amish?
and, but the Catholic Church doesn't seem to be having those same dispensations.
Correct. And for example, there's the Hosanna Tabor case in which the Lutherans were not allowed to do exactly what you just said. They had appointed somebody who was not following their laws, and they fired that person, and our government came in and said, the Lutherans don't have the right to do that. This person should be reappointed.
Well, I'm familiar with most of those cases now, though, and I don't know that one. Of course, the different, pardon?
Hosanna Tabor, the one that was just.
Oh, that's a recent one, yeah. Yeah, that's true in the sense that it looked like they moved slightly on that question, but it gets very complicated here because you then get into other things like what kinds of agreements were made. We have a case going on in St. Louis with a Polish church that has broken away from the archdiocese, and the archdiocese, they appointed their own pastor, and the archdiocese brought suit. So far, at the lower level, the archdiocese has lost. The problem is that way back around 1890, the archdiocese apparently signed off its rights. And so that's why now the courts are siding with the people. And I'm not sure what it was with the Lutherans. In the case of the Amish, there is one very important provision that which I find very interesting. I don't think we would get it. They're not required to send their children to school. A case arose in the 1970s of Amish refusing to send their children to public high school. And the state of Wisconsin tried to force them to do it. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. I don't think they would do that with Catholics, probably. Because again, the Amish are few in number and they're very marginal. We don't have to worry about it. On the other hand, it is a case that if it goes to court eventually, as it will, could be used to uphold the idea of homeschooling, would be very important. I don't think that the courts are specifically biased against the Catholic Church. They're biased against strong, organized religion, and they'd be much more solicitous of sort of marginal groups.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Your presentation makes me want to sign up for one of your courses. I'm a little old for it. But.
It's quite a commute, I can tell you.
He reminds me of Sharia law, and there are many things happening in this country, simple as wearing burqas or not wearing, I think it's burqas that women wear.
Yeah.
And there are many other aspects of Sharia law that are having an impact now in this country. Could you develop that a little bit?
Well, I don't know a whole lot about Sharia law. The analogy that would occur to me would be the canon law of the Catholic Church. And, in other words, an internal legal system. There's no problem, it seems to me, when it involves the internal governance of your church, or like who gets appointed pastor and all that kind of thing. Does the church have a right to make women wear a certain headdress? Yes. Providing you have a right to drop out of the church if you don't want to. You know? I mean, they can't physically coerce you into doing it. But there are other kind of interesting parallels as I understand Sharia. Everybody's familiar with the famous case of St. Thomas Becket, who was martyred in the 12th century by the King of England. The issues there are really not all that clear, because Thomas Becket was a very brave man, and he died a martyr's death, but the principle he was trying to uphold was that clergy are not subject to the civil law. If a priest or a deacon or whatever is accused of a crime, they're not brought before the court, they're only brought before the church courts. The king didn't like that. First of all, nobody's independent of my law. Second of all, the church courts are wimpy, you know, they don't impose the death penalty. So that would be the analogy, you know, if we had the Catholic Church would say, oh, any accused of misconduct is tried before the court of canon law. You know, we don't demand that, we don't ask for that. That seems to me what the Sharia people are asking for, if I understand it correctly, and I don't see how it can be accepted. The place of Muslims in American life is extremely interesting because it cuts two ways. On the one hand, it's kind of a liberal thing to say, oh, tolerance, 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 you're prejudiced against Muslims. And on the other hand, the Muslims take any number of positions, like sexual morality among them, that are abhorrent to the liberal mind. So which way are you going to jump? Yes.
Would it be correct to say that the United States is no longer a Christian country?
Well, correct. Despite what the Supreme Court said in 1892, it never has been officially. It was clear, I mean, depending on what you mean by that, it's clear from the very beginning that Jews were included. You know, nobody ever said, okay, Jews, no, they were very clear about that. There was practically nothing else at the time. There were no Muslims. As they say, John Jay didn't think Catholics should be included, but he lost out on that. The proclamation, so officially we were never a Christian nation. Now, what the court might have meant in 1892 was culturally we're a Christian nation. Most people are Christians. Christian morals tends to dominate, etc. Therefore, the argument was not that Congress did something wrong, but that Congress was misunderstood. Congress could not have intended to exclude ministers of the gospel because we're a Christian people. Culturally, we're not a Christian nation, haven't been for a long time. That's what the battle is really all about. You know, we're having who's going to win the battle for the public square, who's going to win the battle for moral values. On that 1892 case, as a somewhat amusing sidelight, it's been pointed out that the law in question forbidding the importing of foreign labor exempted entertainers. And somebody said, well, why didn't the minister say he was an entertainer? And so, well, I guess they heard him and they knew that wasn't true.
Professor, I don't know if this is even a fair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Could you give us the nickel version?
Can you talk a little louder? Could you maybe come up here a little bit?
Could you give us the nickel version of the decision that will come down tomorrow? Either side, what it will mean for religion?
Oh, I don't know that I know.
I'm not asking the decision, I'm saying either decision, what does that mean for religion?
Yeah. My guess is that they will basically gut the law while leaving certain parts of it intact. If they basically gut the law, it will now become one of the major issues in the presidential campaign. There are a lot of people, including liberal Democrats, who think that Obama made a mistake in making that the principal achievement of his first term, but he has prided himself on having done it. And so if the Supreme Court overturns it, he's going to have to go back to the drawing board and try to come up with something else, and he's going to make that, I think, a major issue. And he's going to say, see, it was these Republican justices which are denying you adequate health care. If it's upheld, well, then that's the end of it, basically. We'll have to see how it works within a few years. The Catholic Church will go on fighting, even if the health care is upheld, the Catholic Church will go on fighting the provisions that we're fighting, and might prevail on that. Even if the law is upheld, we might still prevail on the religious freedom issue. But you know, it's all a matter of one vote. You know, these things all depend on Justice Anthony Kennedy. People know how these four are going to vote, and how that four is going to vote, and how Anthony Kennedy is going to vote. That's the question. It's an interesting thing, by the way, that is rarely noted, which I think very amazing. There is not a single Protestant on the Supreme Court. There are 6 Catholics and 3 Jews. Now, that would have been the case 20 years ago, would have been unbelievable. Now, the Catholics, of course, are of all opinions. so it's not as though they constitute a solid block, but it's an amazing phenomenon. No Protestants on the Supreme Court.
I heard on the radio this morning a man reminding us it isn't about our health care, it's health insurance. Our health care is available, it's how it's paid. So I think by letting them, the side that supports this, call it health care, we should remind them it's just about health insurance.
Yes, I don't claim. Now, one reason why I'm a little bit hesitant to comment on this whole matter is I don't understand the intricacies of this.
Okay.
Nancy Pelosi is supposed to have said,
Right.
well, let's enact the bill and worry later what it means. And it's like 3,000 pages long, and nobody's at all sure what it really says or what the implications of it are. But you're correct, of course, it's a matter of insurance. The key constitutional issue, as I take it, is can the government force people to buy a product? Insurance, medical insurance is a product. Can the government order you to buy a particular product? That seems to be the constitutional issue. And I think the philosophy of the welfare state would be to sort of brush that objection aside and say, look, we're moving to the next highest level, and we should put aside these quibbles that we may have.
I just want to make a correction. It is about healthcare. I just want to make a correction. Whatever you hear, it is about healthcare, we talk about death panels, and whether you believe in death panels or not, in fact, the law establishes a group of experts who are going to tell you what care is worth paying for and what care isn't worth paying for. And that's a scary thing. But it does relate to health care. So regardless of which side you fall, whether that's an efficient system, more efficient than we have today, or less efficient than we have today, that is about health care.
It is, and of course, the background, again, of all of this, when I say, there's not much room for private charity, health care has become so complicated and expensive just in my lifetime. Now, does it need to be? But I mean, the old days of going to the friendly neighborhood doctor and, maybe owing him for 3 years before you can finally pay his bill or something like that, those days are long past. And who's paying for all this equipment? Who's paying for all these tests? It's just gone beyond the ability of all but the wealthiest people to really do that. And is that all necessary? I don't know, but the doctors seem to think that it is. And I think that the death panels are, as you suggest, really inevitable, not necessarily with malicious intent. That is to say, not necessarily saying we don't like you, we're going to pull the plug, but just what you said. The resources are very limited. Who's going to get the resources? Are we going to give it to somebody who's already got a bad heart and he's 74 years old? Or are we going to give it, it's going to be, they call it triage, I think, in rescuing people. You concentrate on those that could be helped. You forget about those that are helpless, or those that might survive on their own, and concentrate on those that could be helped.
Well, I don't know about you, but I am amazed that Dr. Hitchcock could go on for an hour without a note in front of him, and I think it's
Well, I did have one.
tremendously commendable.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Sure, thank you.
I'd just like to tell you that
We're not here to tell you a little bit about Dr. Hitchcock. He comes to us from St. Louis University, where he began his academic career and now is finishing his academic career. He is founding member of the board of the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars. He's senior editor of the ecumenical magazine Touchstone, and he's the associate editor of Human Life International. Pretty impressive. His books include Recovery of the Sacred, The Supreme Court and Religion in American Life, which he spoke about this morning, and The History of the Catholic Church, which he has just about completed and will be published by Ignatius Press in 2012, the fall. He's married to Helen Hull Hitchcock. She's editor of Adoramus Bulletin, which is a liturgical bulletin, and also she is president of Women for Faith and Family. And the Hitchcocks presently live in St. Louis. They have 4 daughters. And I just want to remind you that if any of you are interested, Dr. Hitchcock's Supreme Court talk this morning is going to be on EWTN 3 different days in July. I noticed that yesterday on the website. July 8th, it'll be on at 9:30 a.m. I won't tell you the weird times like 5 in the morning. And Wednesday, July 11th at 5:30 p.m. So if any of you did not hear the Supreme Court talk that Dr. Hitchcock gave, you can hear it and see it on EWTN. So this talk now is about Dignitatis Humanae, the grounding document of Vatican II on religious liberty, which is pretty central to what we're talking about this week. Dr. Hitchcock.
The comment about the German court decision concerning
Circumcision.
circumcision, thank you. Reminds me of a point that we should bear in mind, and that is, for all the problems that we have in this country and the struggles we are going through, religious liberty is in better shape in the United States than it is in just about any other place in the world. You have probably from time to time hear about hate speech and how in Canada, I know, in France, I know, in Sweden, I know, people have been punished by law, fined, or even in some cases jailed, merely for stating publicly that they believe that homosexuality is wrong. And this has happened in some cases even to clergy who have preached that from the pulpit. That there are no doubt, or a lot of people in the United States would like to do that. But up until now, it has not been possible to do that in the secular courts. There have been attempts to enforce this sort of thing on university campuses, which of course is a sign of what would be coming in the future. But we have to be continually vigilant because of the fact that we are better in this regard than anybody else. My guess would be that if the California law were to pass, it would eventually be overturned by the courts as a violation of religious liberty. Anyway, simply to point that out. Many of you, I guess, were alive and aware at the time of Vatican II, as I was, and there was a tremendous spirit of kind of excitement in the world at the time. And a lot of that excitement was due to the fact that the Catholic Church in Rome seemed to be doing things that no one ever thought they would do. And some of these now, in retrospect, they don't look silly exactly, but you don't see that it was ever a problem. We may eat meat on Friday. Whether we should or not is another question, but we may. What was very obvious to lots of people, of course, rather dramatically, changed the liturgy from Latin into English. And the authorization for ecumenical activity, I can remember a time when people were told, you cannot attend a Protestant worship service except perhaps for a wedding or a funeral, but you must make it clear that you're not a participant, you're there as an observer. And then suddenly we're having joint prayer services with Protestants, and official commissions are appointed to engage in theological discussion. There's a whole lot of things going on at that time that seem to mark a reversal almost of things from the past. Now, how that was, why it was, to what extent it was true, is a very vast subject about which I've written books, and so have other people, and I won't go into that right now. But one of the things that did attract so much attention at the time was the Conciliar Decree Dignitatis Humanae as a strong affirmation of religious liberty and the right of people to practice their own religion without coercion. And this was attracted a great deal of attention because it seemed to go against the historic teaching and practice of the Catholic Church. If you had gone back exactly 100 years to what was called the Syllabus of Errors that was issued by Pope Pius IX in 1864, you found what seemed to be almost the opposite being stated. And Pius IX said, among other things, that we, as the Church, do not have to reconcile ourselves to these modern ideas about freedom, which do not recognize the existence of truth. And therefore, we reject those ideas. Now, that was the nub of the problem. Can you recognize freedom of belief without seeming to fall into the error of what was called indifferentism, saying, well, it really doesn't matter what you believe. So we can be tolerant of everyone because none of us are really all that sure of what we believe. That is what Pius IX was very concerned about, and that was what for a long time retarded, you might say, the emergence of a Catholic theology of religious liberty. Now, it should also be borne in mind when you read something like the Syllabus of Errors, where the Pope denounces liberalism by name. Liberalism can mean any number of things, and you have to be careful what you're referring to in a given case. One of the things he's referring to is precisely the notion of political liberty as we understand it: freedom of free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, that these people should be given freedom to express themselves in whatever way they thought was suitable. Besides thinking that this represented compromising the truth, Pius IX also recognized from bitter personal experience that this kind of liberalism in the 19th century was to a great extent hypocritical. And that is that those people who most loudly espoused it often did not practice it. It was the case in Italy, where a liberal monarchy who sets about to unify the country seizes the papal states by force and so forth. It happened repeatedly in France, where when a liberal government would come into power, they would restrict religious schools or sometimes close them down altogether, culminated later on in 1905 by expelling all the religious orders from France and so forth. In case after case, the promise of liberty was not fulfilled. And so liberalism looked to be, as I say, hypocritical. Now, the major exception to this, again, in the 19th century was the United States itself. The United States, in its Constitution, guaranteed freedom of religion. And apart from this troublesome question of polygamy, which we mentioned this morning, that was, in fact, pretty well respected. Now, there was a tremendous history of anti-Catholicism in this country, which includes riots, it includes any number of other things like that, but always extra-legally. It was always a matter, if you want, of vigilante activity, not of the actual activity of the government itself. And so the United States had been, by and large, had fulfilled its promise of religious freedom. Until the Oregon case of the 1920s, there had never been a serious effort to close down the Catholic schools, for example, which liberal governments in Europe sometimes did do. So in understanding the position of Pius IX and some of those who came after him, they tended to be looking at the immediate European situation, at Italy, at France, at Switzerland, and some other places like that. They weren't, for the most part, looking across the ocean at the United States. They may not have been terribly well informed about what was happening in the United States. This was something of a dilemma for American Catholics in that those who wanted to could point the finger and say, you see, you're not good Americans. You don't believe in the freedoms which are guaranteed by our Constitution. If you people came into power, you would revive the Inquisition. You'd throw us all in prison. You'd persecute us. And most American Catholics were puzzled by this because that was far from their intention. And most American Catholics grew up accepting the American political system, including religious freedom, as being a good thing, and probably never delved into it deeply enough to wonder, well, how does this square with what perhaps Pius IX said in the Syllabus of Errors? And to a great extent, the bishops in the United States did not emphasize the point. The bishops in the United States tended to emphasize the idea that there is a good harmony between the Catholic faith and the American ideas of liberty, and would say sometimes that's the trouble in Europe. You see, in places like France, if they had an American notion of liberty, we wouldn't see them closing down the religious schools and so forth. Now, in 1899, Pope Leo XIII issued a kind of a warning to the American bishops and said, wait a minute, you may be going a little bit overboard in your admiration for the American system. It's not by any means perfect. But that was kind of a minor squall, and it didn't really alter things very much. There has been, in American history, two kinds of anti-Catholicism which overlap one another at certain points, but otherwise are rather at polar opposites. One is just ordinary Protestant anti-Catholicism, that the Catholic Church is a false church. The Reformation occurred in order to restore the truth of the gospel. What Catholicism represents, therefore, is something bad. And they didn't usually go so far as to say that it should be suppressed, but they were highly critical of it. These would be people, especially, whom we tend to call fundamentalists. Then there was also the intellectual kind of anti-Catholicism, which comes not from the Reformation, but which comes from the anti-religious movements of the 18th century, the so-called Enlightenment, people like Voltaire. And they said the Catholic Church represents superstition, backwardness. It's not enlightened. And the same people who said that would also condemn the fundamentalists for the same reason. That's why I say their agenda overlapped a little bit, but in some ways they were polar opposites of one another. In the 40s and 50s, this latter theme, that is to say the Catholic Church is intellectually backward and so forth, was especially sounded by a writer named Paul Blanchard, who could be characterized, I think, as a professional anti-Catholic. And he went back and scoured official documents like the Syllabus of Errors and some others, and published books like American Freedom and Catholic Power. And he says, see, that the Catholic Church teaches that they respect religious freedom as long as they're the beneficiaries of it, but that if the time should ever come that they were in power, they would not feel that they had to respect anybody else's religious freedom. And that accusation had some influence. It's a little bit hard to say how much, but it was certainly noticeable. For example, in L. Smith runs for president in 1928. That's a little bit before Blanchard, but was attacked from both sides, both kinds of anti-Catholicism. And then as the John F. Kennedy candidacy in 1960, particularly the kind of things that Blanchard was saying were being hurled at Kennedy, and he himself was very sensitive to it. It's known that he read Blanchard's books and was trying to figure out how he should respond. Around the end of World War II, there was an American Jesuit by the name of John Courtney Murray, who was probably the leading American theologian of that era. We hadn't produced very many first-rate theologians. And he starts to wrestle with this question. And he starts to publish articles advocating that the church take a stand in favor of religious liberty and make it very forthright, and say that quite explicitly that under no circumstances would the Catholic Church favor persecuting or oppressing other religions if it in fact had the power to do so. And he publishes, as they say, a series of articles on that subject. Now, he gets some theological opposition. I hesitate to mention it in these hallowed walls, but the principal opponent was a Redemptorist by the name of Francis Connell. Is Aesopus around here someplace? Is it a town by that name? Anyway, that was where the Redemptorist seminary was, and Francis Connell taught there, and also taught at Catholic U in Washington. He was the defender of the more traditional point of view, and he and Murray were in something of a debate. Now, Connell was not the Grand Inquisitor. That is, he was not saying, come on, we got to throw these people in jail. But his argument he said the Catholic Church favors religious freedom for prudential purposes. What he meant by that was, for various reasons, it's not practical and it's not wise to have one single official religion. First of all, of course, in the United States, we're very far from being a majority, so that's total fantasy to talk about that. But secondly, even in cases where you are a majority, it just may not be wise to enforce your religion on other people. Ireland was often offered as a model, where the Catholics were the vast majority of the people in the Irish Free State, and Ireland was what was called a confessional state, which was, it granted religious toleration to non-Catholics, but the Catholic Church was clearly in a somewhat privileged position. Catholic Church to a great extent dominated the educational system, dominated the health system. The public life in Ireland was shot through with Catholic expressions of Catholicity and so forth. If you were not a Catholic, you might not feel as though you were fully at home here, but on the other hand, you weren't being persecuted. And so that, in a sense, was the ideal that a man like Father Connell offered. Somewhere along the line, John Courtney Murray was told to shut up on that subject. And there was a period of several years when he didn't publish and turned his attention to other theological questions. Then, during Vatican II, from 1962 to 65, Murray is summoned to Rome at the behest of Cardinal Spellman of New York, and is installed as one of the so-called periti, experts, advisors to the council. And he had considerable input into the decree on religious liberty. It was not his own writing, it was not fully his creation, it doesn't altogether reflect his point of view, as you sometimes hear, but he did have an impact. And this was probably the single greatest American contribution at the council for two reasons. One is because Murray had more influence there than any other American theologian, and second of all, because the American experience was then being called upon. What has been your experience with religious freedom, and what can you tell us about it? The decree on religious liberty has to be regarded, I think, as an example of what is called the development of doctrine, and that makes it a somewhat complicated question. Cardinal Newman, John Henry Newman, before he became a Catholic, wrote an essay called An Essay on the Development of Doctrine. And his point was, if you go back through the history of the church, teachings do change, but you have to be careful about what you mean by that. That is, you can't go back to the 2nd century and find there the equivalent of today's catechism of the Catholic Church, as though it were all completely spelled out there already. It wasn't. It was there incipiently, it was there in embryo, and it would unfold over time. That was what he meant by development. It was analogous to the development of a biological organism, which proceeds from its initial core, but then develops in various ways. And the crucial question that Newman was concerned with was, how do we determine authentic development from inauthentic development, which is essentially heresy? And he established certain criteria for that, perhaps the most important of which is each development must somehow be consistent with what went before. Now, in some cases, that's easy enough to show. On the surface, the Dignitatis Humanae doesn't seem so much to be a development as to what went before, but almost in a way a repudiation of what went before. How do you reconcile Dignitatis Humanae with the syllabus of errors? Well, a couple of things that need to be kept in mind here, and that is that there is no formal, official declaration in the history of the church from a council, for example, saying that religious freedom is wrong and that when we come to power we must suppress it. The earliest theologians, the fathers of the church, most of them, were opposed to the use of any kind of coercion in matters of religion, because what good does it do to force someone to convert? If their heart remains the same, then it's empty and meaningless, and it's kind of a perversion of baptism. But as time went on, for a variety of historical reasons, the practice of coercion or persecution had become commonly accepted. And for the most part, the major Protestant reformers accepted it as well. There were very few people in the 16th century who were in favor of religious freedom across the board, and very few that were in favor of it for matters of principle. And this was, as I say, shared really by both Catholics and by Protestants. So one could say that it was never an official solemn teaching of the church comparable to what we find in the Creed, that religious freedom was wrong. There is the syllabus of errors, but it doesn't have the same status as, for example, Pius IX's proclamation of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. It does not rank as a great ex cathedra pronouncement in the same way that the Immaculate Conception did. So in that sense, one could say it isn't as radical a reversal of what went before as might first appear. Now, Dignitatis Humanae is very careful to avoid any hint of religious indifferentism. There is an obligation to believe the truth, the council says. If you are exposed to the truth and you recognize it, you have an obligation to believe it. There is no right to reject it. It is simply not true that all beliefs are somehow equal. The Catholic Church, as it states in the decree on ecumenism, possesses the fullness of truth, and other religions possess parts of the truth or lesser truths to some other degree. You have to take the decree on ecumenism along with Dignitatis Humanae to get the whole picture. Also,